So, Daddy, today is May 28th, 2011, and we're at Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. For what purpose?
To have an enjoyable family time, a
Okay.
truly unique reunion.
It's been a great week, and this is our last night, and everybody else is off at Funland where it's really noisy, and we have a minute of peace here to talk. So, you're here with Sean and me and Ben and Tal and Carol, and any of us might pose a question. Just
That's fine.
And I will start. And with, what is your earliest memory?
Well, my earliest memory, of course, would be our home at 5017 Grace Street in Chicago, Illinois. There were 4 of us in the family, my father and mother and my brother Frank and myself. My recollection of things in the early house, we were in the middle of a depression. My father worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he walked a half a mile to the streetcar every morning and then took a streetcar ride of probably 15 or 20 miles to where he worked on Polk Street down in Chicago, where he was working on electrical parts of the railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, and then he would ride home every night. So it was a long ride for him. I did not see very much of him. He left very early in the morning and returned just about dinner time, but we didn't have much interface as a young whippersnapper.
Can you tell me what your room looked like?
My room was the back bedroom of the floor, and I had a upright piano in it because that just is where they happened to store it. And I was sleeping on a hide-a-bed, a single wide bed, normal length, and I had a dresser, and that was it. But I had toys and things like that, a lot of them.
Did you share your room with Frank?
No, Frank had his own room.
You each had your own room.
And he was 4 years older than I am, and there was very little interface between us because he had his own crowd. He was very much into athletics, which I was not. But I used to study little things that would last a long time for me. My recollection was, for example, I had Tootsie Toy toys, little cars and so forth, and I would sit underneath the window of our dining room and play on the floor, and I would build very extensive construction with blocks, and I would play for hours there. It just so happened our telephone was in that room. It was a party line telephone at the time. The thing was equipped with a slot, so we either put a coin or a slug in the slot to make phone calls. So of course my mother was in and out all the time, but she was pretty much doing her thing. She was not working at that time. And as I was growing up, I began taking walks with her because the nearest stores to us was right at the corner of the street I was on, and it was about 50 yards to the store, but they were more expensive than the other ones, so she would walk a half mile, no, full quarter mile to the stores, the A&P store, which was less expensive.
And then did you help her carry the stuff
And
down?
I carried the bags, yes.
So you didn't take a wagon, you just carried it?
I probably had wagons earlier on, and it kind of grew up. I didn't do it all early on, but then as I got older, I did a lot of it.
Did you have a favorite hiding place?
I don't believe so. I was out climbing the tree in the backyard and things like that from as young as I can remember, and we had a lot of kids in our neighborhood. So I wasn't hiding as such.
Okay.
Was it urban or suburban?
This is urban.
Chicago.
Yeah, this is Chicago, and
And you were born here?
it was deep, fully, the square mile that I lived in was fully occupied. There were very few prairies, which is what we used to call empty lots.
Prairies.
Yeah. If kids wanted to play, they would go to an empty lot and they could dig holes in the earth and stuff.
Did you build forts?
Oh, we built forts in the wintertime, but we played that these were in a prairie. If there was a groove, and there generally was some, those would be forts, but you know, imagination.
Okay.
You were born in Chicago? I
Born in
didn't know that.
Chicago, 1924, and of course the Depression didn't come along until 1929. So there was nothing poor about our family for the first few years. But then as it got longer, why, the money got shorter and so forth.
Did your dad stay employed the whole time during the Depression?
Yes, he did. However, he was gone a lot, and from time to time he would be sent off. For example, there was a flood in Louisville, and it affected the train operation, particularly because of the electrical controls of trains. So he was sent down there for a long period of time at one time.
Can you describe first your mom?
Well, she's a lady.
Yeah.
I don't know how I would describe her. She was just average height, perhaps a little on the heavy side. She was very sharp. She had been a clerk in World War I and worked for the government, and that's where she had met my father. She was very good in English, good teacher, and she was very attentive when she was with me.
And was she loving?
Oh yes, very much so.
And how about your daddy?
She died, boy, it was late. I think she was pretty close to 90, something like that.
And how about your father? Tell me about him.
My father was raised in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and he put in time in the Army in World War I. He had played high school baseball, and let's see, I think probably baseball is all I really know. But he was a technical person. He was very handy with all tools, and he had a house full of tools, and he taught me how to use all of them. He drank too much, and that was his downcoming. He was actually in an automobile accident, and that is what terminated his job with the railroad.
When was that, Dad?
It would have been in the 30s, probably around 34, maybe 35, something like that. We had not had an automobile until that time, 34, 35, something like that. He
So you
finally
were
got
about
a
10.
car. My mother never learned to drive, and we didn't have the car very long because he had too much one night. Had an accident, a man was killed, and my father had all kinds of things to go through. He lost his railroad job at that time and went to work for the government building battleships in Brooklyn.
So how did that affect you? You were about 10 when that accident happened?
Oh, I was younger than that. I was used to the fact that he didn't have much time for me. He had a lot of time for my brother because he was interested in baseball, and I didn't really care if baseball came or went. But I had lots of friends in the neighborhood, and we would hang around. One of the things we did as little kids, the people across the street were largely Polish, second generation at most, but they would pitch horseshoes at night, and all of the kids in the neighborhood would go over there and watch them pitching horseshoes and things like that.
Did you get to do any pitching yourself? Or?
Oh, at 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 years
weren't
old,
old
you
enough.
don't take a big cast iron horseshoe.
So
We
what did
just watch.
you said you played with toy trucks and cars?
Yeah.
What other kinds of play do you remember from when you were really little?
Well, I did a lot of exploring around the neighborhood and with other friends and stuff. We were 2 blocks from our school, and we walked both ways in the morning and at noontime and then afterward. And if we had snow, for example, the snow would have been shoveled off of the sidewalk and put into big heaps along the sidewalk, and all of the kids would learn to make a trail every morning in the snow, and everybody going to school would go through the trail, up and down for 2 or 3 blocks.
Do you remember having snow days, or was the school always open?
The school I don't remember any snow days. If it snowed, we went to school.
Didn't make any difference.
None.
So what was your elementary school called?
William Perry Gray Public School. It was, when it started, it was 8 grades, 8 levels. And my buddy across the street had a father who started in this school a full generation earlier. So it was there before 1900, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a good school. 2 floors. It had an auditorium. I have no recollection of a gymnasium, but there was some big rooms that we would have assemblies in besides the auditorium.
Do you remember any of your teachers?
I remember a couple of names, but I did not know them very well. When I got up to the higher levels of that school, I was actually allowed to carry messages and packages and so forth from the school down to the downtown part of Chicago and deliver them to the Board of Education for principal.
So how old were you then?
I was 8 and 9.
They sent you out in the city.
My mother said that I was free to travel anywhere in the city, and as a matter of fact, probably the most interesting event that I was involved in when I was, this was 1933 and 34, the Chicago World's Fair.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask about.
1930.
Bless you.
In 1933, my mother took me to the World's Fair. We walked 2 full blocks, which is a quarter of a mile. We took the bus downtown. That was 52 Addison. That was what I learned as soon as I was yay big.
How much did a bus ride cost then?
Bus was a nickel
Nickel?
for me. I don't really know what the adults paid, but I was never an adult back in that time. But we went down to the Chicago World's Fair, and it was an immense thing, probably 3 miles or more in length.
Wow.
And the Chicago area where this was held had, at the front entrance of this World's Fair, they had the Field Museum of Natural History, an Adler plantation, Adler, first looking at the skies, astronomy. And
Planetarium?
Planetarium was the word I was looking for, yeah. And then I had been to a number of historical museums, and I loved those, and I memorized things constantly when I went to them. But the World's Fair was interesting in that we traveled all over the thing, and she took me to everything that I might be interested in. A lot of them were historical at the time, new things.
Or scientific?
And probably the biggest claim of my childhood was the second year I was allowed to go to the World's Fair alone.
And you were how old?
Well, 34, I was 10.
So was there a subway then?
No, we had Chicago Motor Club buses, and I could get on 52 Addison. It would take me to the World's Fair. I would see it, get back on the right bus, and take me home.
So did she give you money to get in? Was there like an
Oh,
admission?
yeah, but there wasn't a lot of money, you know.
Right,
It's,
not at that time.
Back in those days, the buses and streetcars were a nickel for elementary school level kids.
How do you think your childhood was affected by growing up during the Depression?
It really wasn't bothered because I didn't know what it was, and we never were hungry. Some of our neighbors at times they said we're hungry, but you know, our neighborhood was a little bit better than that because almost everybody was working. And this was during the time of the CCC, and so some of the younger people in the neighborhood were away at CCC camps, and so I don't think that I suffered because of the Depression. But
Did Frank participate in CCC?
no, he was only 4 years older than I was.
So he was too young.
And so he was only there through high school. Then he did go to the University of Illinois for one semester, but by that time the CCC was about wrapped up. He had numerals 41, which meant that had he finished college, it would have been the class of 1941. But he only went to 1 year.
Well, and that takes us right into World War II.
Well, can I ask one more question about Chicago?
Yes.
Would you consider it a safe city back then? You hear so much about it now. You absolutely could go anywhere in the city.
Oh, yes, for me, because, you know, they're not going to bother kids. It was not,
But it was like gangsters.
nowhere
like,
around us was there anything serious. Now, the gangster thing was one that you heard about all over the world
Yeah.
because these gangs had been, for example, the Dillinger gang had been as far north as we lived, but they were way over along the lake shore, which was about 8 or 9 miles away. And you know, people weren't running around in cars shooting people like they do in the movies.
with the Tommy guns out the car.
Yeah,
So you don't remember much about the gangsters?
No, I didn't read newspapers, you know. I did go to school and I got very good grades. And I could read newspapers, but I probably stuck mostly with Little Orphan Annie and Gasoline Alley and all of the other comics.
So you watched the comics? You looked at the comics?
Well, I didn't watch them because
Right.
they weren't broadcast.
So do you remember the invasion of Poland and the beginning of World War II?
Well, I remember hearing about it, yes. I was in high school, and I graduated from high school in February of 1942. I very distinctly remember when the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred. I was home alone. At that time I was living with this buddy of mine, a friend, because my parents had moved away. And I was living with my buddy, and I was listening to the radio and heard all of this stuff. And of course that was shook me up.
Did you have any idea what it would mean to you personally?
Oh, certainly. I mean, you grow up quickly when there's a war starting like that. My brother finished his 1 year of college and he really couldn't afford to stay again, so he got a job with a big wholesale outfit, and he took the bus and streetcar to get to work. And about that time it was getting serious, so he enlisted in the Marines. And I think he enlisted in the Marines in maybe in 1940. And
So before Pearl Harbor?
I think so, yes. But I'm not really positive. I didn't keep records of him. I kept my
Of
own.
course.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, were you intensely aware, once we were involved in the war, were you intensely aware of battles that we were involved in?
Oh, certainly. Certainly, I was. as I said, I graduated in February of '42, and in May or June of '42, I went to enlist in the Air Force to fly airplanes. And I didn't get accepted because I was bow-legged, which is another long story, but I can tell you if you'd like to
Sure,
hear
tell
it.
us about being bow-legged.
All right, I went through this thing, and it was kind of an interesting experience because I weighed 137 pounds, soaking wet, and I'm in this recruiting center in downtown Chicago, and half the kids that are there were at least 2 or 3 or 4 years older than I was, and they were hulking monsters, and I'm going through this test. And I took the written exam and had no trouble with that. And that very fast, probably less than an hour on the test. Most of the people took longer than that. And then they lined us up, and they started, the hallways were filled with people, and the doctors, or the corpsmen perhaps, were going down listening to hearts, one after one, and they'd go down here 2 or 3, and they'd come back and listen to this guy again, and come back again, and they'd say, you're out. And of course, they had gone by me 2 or 3 times and stuff. And I got all through with the physical exam, and they hadn't said anything, but this doctor came out and started talking to us individually. And he sat there and looked at me, and I know what was going through his mind. He was sitting there and saying, I can't send this 137-pound kid into a war. And so he looked at me, he says, you're bow-legged. And I says, yeah? And he says, well, I don't think we can take you. And of course, I was devastated and angry. And so the next morning, I was downtown again, across the street, in naval recruiting. The V-12 program, I wanted to fly Navy airplanes. I passed the entire physical and the written exam. I was filling out my enlistment papers. And at the bottom of it, of course, all these forms says $50,000 fine for wrong answers, tell the truth. And there was a question at the bottom that says, have you ever taken an exam for military flying before? And so I said yes, and they called me in, and they said, well, when was this? And I said, yesterday. Where was it? Across the street. And so the guy picks up the phone, dials a number, or maybe it wasn't dial at that time, but he picked it up, called the number. And he gave my name and told him that I was there and so forth, and why had I been turned down? And he's listening and listening, and he hangs up and he says, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard in my life. And he turned to me and he said, however, the Navy can't take anybody the Army has turned down.
It was the Army Air Corps.
Period. That's the end of it. So I went home, and I'm furious. So I went to my draft board the next day. Went to him. I said, I volunteered for both of them. I passed the exams, but they won't take me because I'm bow-legged. And the guy says, that's the silliest thing I ever heard. But he says, we'll give you, we can't let you free from the draft. However, would you be interested in a deferment? And I said, yes, I'd like 1 year so I can go to college and maybe put on some weight and stuff. And so they gave me a 1-year deferment, and had they not done that, I never would have gone to the junior college and met my future wife.
So it ended up being a good thing.
It was, absolutely. Probably saved my life also, because at that time, 1942 and 43, there were tremendous numbers of people going into flying, and we were starting massive bombing, and an awful lot of airplanes were shot down in 41, 42, late 41, 42, and early 43. So it might have saved my life that way also.
Because you went in later.
Mhm.
The following year, after I had the 1 year of college, I went back to my draft board and said that I'd finished college and I'm going to go back and apply. And I went back to the Air Force, Army Air Forces recruiting station and went in, took the exam, and
Did you weigh more than 130?
still weighed 137 pounds.
Yeah.
But I was a year older, and I think it was about 3 days later where I was on a troop train heading from Miami Beach to basic training. So,
Tell me, but let's rewind a little bit in time. Tell me about jobs you did when you were young.
okay, jobs were very interesting because there was a depression on, and I didn't really know it, but I knew that money was hard to come by, and I went to my corner. I've told you about the store on the corner of my street, and I said, can you use me to do odd jobs? And they said yes, and they hired me immediately, and I got 35 cents for 3 hours work
Whoa.
from 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 6 o'clock at night. And all I had to do was haul all of the groceries that the people had called to order or deliver them anywhere. But I worked at that for, I guess, 2 or 3 years.
Did you use a bicycle or what? How did you take groceries to people?
Mostly I walked, but I later got a bicycle and I used it later. Getting the bicycle was really a nice thing because my uncle, who was the husband of Aunt Florence, he had money, and he decided that he was going to take my cousin Shirley and myself down to Marshall Fields, downtown Chicago, and buy us a meal. And so he drove out in his convertible and picked us up and took us down there. We both went into this beautiful restaurant in Marshall Fields, and we both ordered hot dogs. I can still hear him laughing, but they were good hot dogs. And he bought her something, I don't know what it was now, but he bought me this bicycle, which was a Schwinn, the latest version, only it didn't say Schwinn on the front, it said Marshall Fields. And it had all the big balloon tires and stuff, so I had the nicest bike in the neighborhood.
Your friends were all jealous?
Well, naturally, sure.
Pause. All right.
Okay.
I gotta get this started again because it dies after half an hour. All right. Go for it.
So how old were you for that Marshall Fields trip?
It had to be 1938, I guess, something like
So
that.
you were about 14.
Yeah, somewhere in there. 37 or 38. As a matter of fact, that was the other thing that occurred then, is my buddy Bob Gorski, who lived across the street, and I decided we would join the Boy Scout troop. And we had a troop right across, kitty corner across the nearest intersection. And we both were very active in it. We met a lot of people, and I got very active in the Boy Scout program.
Did you get to go camping out in the wilderness?
Yes. Well, they're not wildernesses. Around Chicago, you have what are called forest preserves. And these are areas that are set aside. They're really a park, but they don't have lots of loose activities going on. They have places where you put kids off and they can build a campfire and pitch a tent, things like that.
So how often did you get away and go do that?
Oh, I went every time we could get a troop camping trip or something like that going up, yeah. I did not have any problems with school. I cannot recall ever doing any homework.
Mom said the same thing.
Because, you know, we learned what we're supposed to do, we passed the tests, and no, I didn't have to study at home. Our teachers were pretty good. But,
Okay.
okay.
What high school did you go to?
I went to Edward G. Foreman Senior High School. It was the same one my brother was in. He was actually 3.5 years ahead of me. And it was a very small school by Chicago standards. I think probably there was about 1,300 in a graduating class. And it was a 3-story building. And, the walk for that was 3/4 of a mile each way. And
Uphill and in the snow, both ways?
no, there was no uphill, it's just straight out in Chicago.
So 6 blocks?
Right along the sidewalk.
So 6 blocks?
Well, it was 6 blocks, but that was 12 streets,
Mm.
because they were the way, the blocks were half blocks,
Mm-hmm.
because the streets were all on.
Right.
Now, I think you told me that you were a cheerleader in high school.
Yes, well, I started out in the first year, and I was taking crafty work, wood shop and stuff like that, and print shop, both of which I loved and got into it real quickly. Well, the guy that was the coach of the cheerleaders was the head of the electrical shop, and so 3 or 4 of us all joined that, and we stayed for the rest of our high school time as cheerleaders.
Did you do gymnastics as part of cheerleading?
We helped the girls do flips and things like that.
But you didn't do
No,
flips yourself?
No.
Because I've always had visions of you doing backflips
Well,
and stuff.
I was still 137 pounds. I couldn't
Well, that would
throw
make it easier,
myself.
Dad. So tell us about when you met Grandma.
Okay, as I said, when I got the deferment from the selective service, I enrolled in Wright Junior College, and that was also attended by a number of my other friends, like George Ranke, the man that I lived with. He also went to there, and
You live with their family, right?
no, I lived with his family.
Right, right.
I should go back to 1937.
Okay.
My dad lost his job with the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he went to work for the Navy Department. So my mother and dad moved to Brooklyn, because he was working in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and both my brother and I decided we did not want to move, and we found places that would take us in. I with my buddy, and my brother with his, I think one of his good friends' parents took him in. And our parents paid us the amount of money we needed for our food and keep and so forth. So we were not with our parents anymore. So I enrolled in Wright College, and during the first month in the school, I was walking down the hall and I heard the dance band rehearsing, and I went over to, went into it, and there were no empty seats, which is unusual, because usually if the band is in there practicing, there's all kinds of seats all around. For some reason, there were none there, and I looked around for some place to sit down and couldn't find anything, so I went over and leaned on the back of the piano. And whenever there was a break between the numbers and stuff, I would get in a word or two. But I did manage to get.
Because Grandma was playing the piano.
I did manage to get a date that night, and I took her out to a movie. So that's how Wright Junior College and my future bride met.
So what do you remember about her first?
Well, of course, the music was wonderful, and I loved Glenn Miller music, and she's in there playing away like mad, and everybody is admiring her ability to do these things and stuff. And so with the date, why I met, and then I started courting, I guess you would say, and she lived about 8 miles from where I lived. So I was on streetcars and buses and stuff to go see her and vice versa. And after some period of time, why they asked me if I would like to move in there because they had a room for.
At Grandma and Grandpa Soper's?
Yes,
Before you got married?
yes.
Oh.
I met them, of course, and
They were
he-
nice to you? They liked you?
Oh yeah, and he needed some help around the house, like he couldn't get up on a ladder for anything. And I ended up painting. The only time I ever painted a room in my life was in their house. I did some touch-up painting all over and stuff, but anyway,
First and last.
they liked me, and
So you lived there before you got married?
yes, oh yes.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, way back. I took my little folding bed and carried it out there, and I slept in the basement.
In the basement?
Yeah.
So who else was in the basement? Mom was trying to remember where
Nobody-
everybody
nobody.
slept. So her dad wasn't, was grandma's?
Grandma was there, but she was upstairs. I think she was in perhaps with Grandma Soper.
Well, Mom said that her grandma and grandpa lived in the
Her
living room.
grandpa was not there when I was there.
He had already died.
already gone on, yeah.
Okay.
So, and I kind of think that, well, I don't know where Papa Soper worked or something. I don't remember whether he was in a bedroom or what, but I was in the basement. Everybody else was upstairs.
Okay. All right. So we'll go back to after college, you've met Grandma, but you're still not in the service yet when you met her, right?
I was not in service then. That's right, yeah. And
Okay.
after I got finished the 1 year of college, I quit that and went into service. So.
Okay. So, did you have what is it, MOS? What's the term for,
Well, I went in as an aviation cadet,
okay.
which meant that I was destined to learn to fly either as a pilot, a navigator, or a bombardier.
Okay.
When I started in, I didn't know what I would be, but I was an aviation cadet. And so she was just at home. She had finished her 2 years of college and had gone to work for the telephone company, living at home.
Mm-hmm.
So,
What do you remember about your wedding?
oh, I remember every single detail.
Tell us about it.
Well, after I graduated from flying, and we were to get married, I spent 5 whole days as a single bachelor officer. The 6th day was our wedding. The wedding was in the church where she had attended. She liked it at the best because it was where all our friends went, and it was a big social event. So while we were, living there, we went to that church.
Was Frank in your wedding?
No, my brother went into the Marines, and right after VJ Day. Right after Hawaii.
Pearl Harbor?
Pearl Harbor. And actually, he was in it before then. His first assignment as a Marine was beach patrol. And he marched along a beach at night protecting the air base.
Which air base?
And the air base happened to be in the big lake in Seattle. But I don't know, he was there probably 2 or 3 months, and then he was sent to Camp Pendleton in San Diego, where he went through OCS and became a lieutenant.
Oh.
And
So,
so he went overseas and was overseas almost the entire World War II,
and did he serve in the Atlantic or Pacific?
Pacific.
In the Pacific.
He was on the tail end of Guadalcanal, and then Bunda and Bougainville and several other little islands up there. And then some of the bigger islands, and then about that time he had to go to Guam because of a football injury is bothering his leg, so they sent him to Guam to the hospital to repair his leg. And when he got through in the hospital, his division had left the Southwest Pacific and gone home, and he got transferred to the new division that was going to be there. So he got to stay there for 4 years.
In Guadalcanal.
Yeah, well, over in far South Pacific.
Was he infantry? He was an officer, but
He was an officer. He was a head of a anti-aircraft activity. It was
Okay.
called Special Weapons.
yeah.
Did you correspond with Frank?
Oh, I wrote to him. Not very often, but you know, enough. He didn't have time to write either. But
Did you feel close to him?
not really. No, he was in his own crowd all through our high school time. He was a all-state baseball and basketball player, and he had his own crowd, and they were off all the time. So I never saw
Did you-
much of him.
Did you kind of idolize him?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
naturally. So all-state baseball and basketball. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, talk about when you talk about World War II for you, your training and your service.
Well, yeah, I can sum it up very simply. Like I said, I went through that exam, and a week later they issued me my train ticket, and I traveled from Chicago to Miami Beach. I actually had basic training in Miami Beach. I lived on the 7th floor of a resort hotel at the corner of 14th Street and the ocean. And the big thing about that was when you are in basic training, you are in your bed at night, and then the bugle blows and you fall out and go into formation to be head counted and stuff. Well, the only thing that was about this is we had to run down 7 flights of steps out on the street and fall into formation, and they would count us off, and then they would dismiss us, and we would run up 7 flights of stairs, get our mess kits, and then fall down 7 flights of stairs. It didn't take long for my legs to get very strong, because we were running all the time. The hotel had elevators, but they were not available to cadets during the day. We could use them in the evening after we were off duty.
Okay.
And when we would run up and with our stuff and get our mess kit and run down, we would go march to the mess hall, which was in another hotel about 2 blocks down the street. We would eat, come back in front of our hotel. We would fall out and run up 7 flights of stairs, put our mess kit in, get our canteen and whatever we needed for drill, and fall down 7 flights of stairs. And then we would march off to a golf course where they did the outside part of the training, physical training. We do our some of the things in there.
Calisthenics.
We had lectures and stuff, basic calisthenics. But then after we finished on the golf course with the educational portion, we marched back to the barracks and then fell up the 7 flights of stairs and peeled down to our gym shorts and then ran down the stairs and went marched across the street on the beach outside of this hotel where we did our calisthenics. And then we would come back and run up the flight of stairs and shower and.
So were there any regular guests at the hotel?
That was the first element of my training, and that would be about 30 days, I think. I don't remember exactly what it was, but we saw lots of movies and VDs, films, and this and that, and all the other things. And then I was shipped with all of my flight to Syracuse University. We went by train. It was a train full of passenger cars, and they had a couple of cargo vans in the train, you know, box cars, and that's where the food was. They cooked our meals over portable stoves in these box cars, and we marched through to eat the mess on the train. It was a little court.
Were you in on cars with seats? I mean.
Oh yeah, there were seats, but
Okay.
coaches.
Right.
Yeah. So
Okay.
and we were only going from Miami to Syracuse, New York.
Okay.
And then we got off the train at Syracuse and we marched up the hill to the university, and they had what had been a boys' dormitory, and our company was assigned to that for bed, and that was just barracks for me. And we went to classes in the actual university, marched everywhere, ran a lot, sang songs while marching constantly, and it was very fun. It was about 5 months, and we got the equivalent of military idea of what you would need for a basic college education. We were now educated enough to be officers for, one semester, short semester.
Sean, do you have any questions about that period since you?
Oh, it takes 4 years to do it now, and OCS is that's
Well,
great.
there was a war on it, so
Right.
they were doing things as fast as they could. Almost every university in the country had what they called a CTD, College Training Detachment, and they would send a group there, and they would just put a couple of basic people to march you back and forth and supervise your conduct, and then you would be under, classes and stuff. So it was a way to get a quick education for people, to get a basic idea, so you could be officers and gentlemen when you graduate.
That was OCS.
So was it?
Well, it wasn't OCS. It was leading up to it was the prelim for the aviation cadet program.
Okay.
I was still going to be a pilot.
And that's how you got the commission. Was the first
Yeah.
piece of it.
So were you?
Before I got, we didn't get commissioned there. We got commissions after we got our wings.
Okay. So I know you were assigned to Italy.
Well, yes and no. After I went through basic training basic college training at Syracuse, we were all trained down to Nashville, Tennessee, where all of us went through, and these are people from all of the colleges coming through. We went through a course of classification where we did certain maneuvers and filled out certain books and things like that, and then this would determine whether you were qualified to be a pilot, a navigator, or a bombardier. I qualified as all three, as did many others, but I preferred piloting, so that's what I opted for and got it. From there, we went to Maxwell Field, Alabama, where they had the formal cadet training program where we learned to march like officers and so forth. And that was a very concise military conduct type thing. You learn how to do everything right.
Is that where you learned to eat soup?
You learn to eat by the
Oh, the
numbers and all
protocol.
that stuff. All that. And then after that, I went to a storage area because they did not have room for us in the next step. So I was sent to a place down in Georgia, near Atlanta, where I worked on the flight line. And my job was to pre-flight the radios for all the airplanes that were going to be flying with the class that morning. And so for about 3, 4, 5 weeks, something like that, we just worked on the base, and then they had room for us to go to the primary flying. And I went to primary flying at Orlando, in the Orlando area of Florida, and I learned to fly PT-17s, soloed, and started the program. From there I went to basic and then to advanced, and then in advanced we also had to go through instrument school to learn to fly under instruments, which most of the pilots in World War II did not do. They didn't have time to spend to teach them all to fly instruments, so there were just our class and some after that. Consequently, when I got out of the service and into the reserve, I was teaching World War II pilots how to fly instruments because they had never had the training that was necessary. So then, after I went through advanced at T6s, I had 5 days after I got my wings and my commission. I had 5 days to go home and pick up my bride, and we got married. We were married in the Presbyterian church in Norwood Park, and the reception was in the basement of the church, and we had punch and cookies and things like that. And then we took our honeymoon. We went to a state park in Indiana, I believe it was, and that's where our honeymoon was. And from the honeymoon we went back to Chicago, and we went down to Moultrie, Georgia, where I was going to be in pre-fighter training. And so she rented a bedroom in a house there, and I got in my uniform and went out to the base, and we started flying P-40s, and then later into gunnery training. That was a trip down to Eglin Field to do gunnery and bombing. So then,
And the war was still going on then.
the war was still going on.
But it was 1945 by then?
This was, yeah, I got commissioned in March of 45. And I was scheduled to be flying P-51s on the invasion of Japan. And our organization that was going to be in this mission went to Shepherd Field at Wichita Falls, Texas. And our function there was to learn about the spies we were going to be putting ashore in Japan before the invasion. These spies, of course, were weather and intelligence observers. And our mission in flying P-51s on the invasion of Japan was we were to go in and drop supplies to these weather reconnaissance teams, and then shoot up everything we could see to give them the impression we were on a tactical mission, so that they didn't really know that we were supplying these teams. And that was what we were supposed to do, and we were waiting and waiting and waiting, and VJ Day came along. And on VJ Day, they delivered our P-51 airplanes, and we never got to fly them, and they were immediately grounded because they were brand new off of the production line airplanes, and they didn't want to wear them out with pilots that they didn't need at that time. So they grounded them and put them
You
in
never
the
got to
storage.
fly.
Never got to fly a P-51.
P-51.
But you were then assigned to Italy.
Yeah, I had flown P-40s and I had done gunnery and bombing and stuff. Then they said, okay, you got your choice. You can either get out of service or you can go overseas. And I talked to Louise and I said, you know, they've given me all this training and the war is still essentially on because they needed people overseas, although not to fight, but to get things gathered up and cleaned up and, you know, ship us back and stuff. So I said, I'll go overseas, and I went to Italy for a year.
What do you remember about Italy
Oh,
after the war?
I know everything that I possibly could imagine. I did everything. We started out, for example, after we volunteered to go overseas, we were shipped to by train up to the New York area and waited until we got a C-54 transport.
So you didn't go on a troop ship. You
No,
you flew.
No, we flew.
Yeah, Space A.
And we had orders to fly, and they delivered us to Paris at Orly Airport. And when we got there, our orders said we were to go to Paris, but it didn't say where we were supposed to go after that.
Hmm.
So we got over there and we all got together and we says, okay, we don't know where we're supposed to go. Let's get some quarters and let them find us.
But where's
And
Paris?
so we went into this hotel in a block from the Champs-Élysées.
Champs-Élysées.
And this, what's the monument, the drive-through thing on Champs-Élysées?
Yeah.
There's
Right.
an arch.
Yeah. The
And
square.
I can't think of the name of it now, but we were right, you know, 2 doors from that arch. And we got our liquor ration and we were waiting to get the orders and finally they sent us the orders and we were, actually we decided we were running out of money and we better find out where we were supposed to go, and we knew we were supposed to be in this 5th wing of AACS, and we think maybe it was supposed to be in Wiesbaden. So we went back to this office we'd been reporting into as casuals, and they said, oh yes, that's where you're supposed to go. So we got bused to Wiesbaden, and we were there and got a little bit of briefing, and we were there probably 2 weeks or something like that. And then we,
Did you do any work while you were there? Or?
no,
Hurry up and wait.
they didn't know what they were going to do with us, you know. We were just, we came in and surprised them. That's why they hadn't had people there to move us there. And so after we got there in the hotel, which was very nice in Wiesbaden, and very nice mess hall and debate downstairs.
Sure.
We found out that we were going to get divided up and sent to all different places, and I ended up getting orders to go to Naples. And they said, well, I guess we'll have to send you by train. And we said, hey, we're pilots. Let us see if we can get a ride. So we did. We found a ride that took us to Rome. We got to Rome, and there was no flights to take us to Naples. So we ended up on New Year's Day, 1946, sitting in the back of a weapons carrier and rode in the back of the truck from Rome to Naples. We finished off our liquor ration
Yeah.
by the time we got there. And we got into this headquarters in Naples, and they trying to figure out where to send us because we were filling in for people who were going home, and they needed just people to do it. It wasn't any assignment that we were there for. And so they selected me to go back to Rome, but this time I did get to fly up there. And I was based at Ciampino Airport on the south edge of Rome, and my duty was in the control tower, and we were starting up commercial aviation in Europe. And our job was to make sure that the air traffic control system would get airplanes in and out of these airports. Now, for those of you that didn't know it, before World War II, each country had its own control towers and stuff, and nobody coordinated any flights between them, and they talked in their native language. When the war was over, the Allies decided that English would be the only language used in all of the airports throughout the world. And so we were in the control tower at Rome as Air France came in for their first flight. Everybody was coming into Rome because that was a big city. And it was kind of exciting. The first Air France airplane that came in was a captured German transport called a Ju-52 that the French had taken away from the Germans and were using this for their first airline flight. And it came into Rome, and the pilots were not really too sharp, so they let down out over the water, lowered themselves down to where they could see the ground, and then they edge hopped into Rome. That was commercial airline Air France version, January 1946.
Well, I'm
That
sure
was
you thought very highly of the French anyway at the end of the war.
Well,
Now, I have a memory as a kid of you speaking ill of Italians or Italy, that you didn't like it much, or,
no, that's not true.
okay, all right.
I had a nice assignment there, and we didn't have much to do with the Italians as such, and they were very poor because they had been part of the Axis, and so
Right.
there was not a lot of money going around. And the United States was trying to build up the country again, so no, they were all right. They're good people.
Then it's a wrong memory. So you came back to the U.S. and you built a house. Tell us about your house that you built and what you
Okay,
did.
this was 1 year later. I was overseas for 1 full year, and I got shipped back, and we got to Grandma's house, in Norwood Park, and we were looking for a place to live. We were here in this bungalow, and it was kind of crowded, and we had some friends. The particular friends were the Gillers, and they lived in Park Ridge, and we were talking about our problem, trying to find an apartment or a house or someplace to live. We wanted to get away from Grandma and Grandpa, and they suggested that we might build a house, because they had built a house. So Louise and I went out and looked through some magazines that had house plans in it. We found one that we liked, and I decided that this guy who had built his own house, he had no more background than I did, so I'll do that. I took the building plans and went down to the City Hall and said, we bought a lot, 2 doors away from this good friend of ours. We knew about it, was available, and it was within the amount of money we had. And incidentally, the amount of money that I had at that time, I believe, was about $3,200. And we're talking about building a house. And,
Buying land.
and the lot, well, the lot came to a couple $1,000s, but it was out in a country area, not in the city. There was no street. There was a farm across the street, and this vacant lots were along the street. I went out and they looked at it, and the building inspector said, you can't build this house here because this is basically a frame house. And after the Chicago fire, they didn't have any frame houses in urban areas of Chicago and these communities. So I said, okay, and I went home and I redrew the plans. I converted a frame house foundation and stuff. I increased the size of the foundation and made it poured concrete and put all the things in that would make it legal. And I drew the plans up, and then they said, well, you need an engineer to sign these. And I had a buddy, well, Louise and I had a buddy who was, we knew their kids, but this man was a architect slash building inspector. And he worked for the city of Chicago, as he in fact had built the Outer Drive Bridge. And we went to him and I said, so what would it take me to get these plans approved to build a house? And he looked at them and he said, what do you need the plans approved for? And I said, well, these plans used to be for a frame house and I redrew them. And oh, he said, signed the plans, we took them out. I had gone to all of the contractors that I needed. I went to a hole digger or excavator. I went to a foundation man or cement pourer.
Concrete.
I went to a bricklayer, and I went to a heating contractor. I think that was all I really needed. And I went to the lumber company and I sized out all of the material I needed and got the price per board feet and all that stuff. And I got all these estimates from these people, and the things that I'd learned by going through the lumber yard and picking out what I wanted and ordering, making a list of them. And I said, well, I now have my estimate for all this material and for these contracts came to $13,000. And we had a total of $5,000. And I said, I need an $8,000 mortgage. And they talked to this buddy of mine, and he said, well, I went downtown to Chicago, home loan, I don't know, not home loan, but I forget what the term was, but for a building and loan. And I went down there and I said, I'd like to get a loan, and they said, how much you need? And I said, $13,000. He said, what are you going to do with that? And I said, I want to build this house. And I handed him the plans. The guy looked at it and he said, you can't build this for $13,000. And I said, oh yes, I can. I laid down all the estimates and the lists of the materials. He looked at him and he says, my God, if you can make that kind of plans, you sure as hell can do it. So they gave me a $13,000 loan at 4% under the GI Bill.
Nice.
And we built the house.
And
I built the house.
You already had Carol by then.
During the process, this was 1947 that I was doing this planning and stuff, and Carol was in 48. So
Did
it
you
was,
eventually come in on schedule and on budget?
You better believe it.
Mm.
That's a first in the history of this country.
Yeah.
I,
What do you remember about being a new dad?
being what?
A new dad.
Well, I was awful busy at that time. I was still building the house. You know, when the baby came along, I was a little bit busy. I was working for the telephone company for 40 hours a week, and I was flying in the reserve on weekends whenever I could possibly get away, and I was building a house in my spare time. I literally put the roof on after dark, the whole roof. So it was busy time. And then of course I'm pushing the contractors to come in and dig the hole, and then I had my buddy came out and did the layout of the excavation and marked them off, and so he was very nice to me. This B.J. Grimley was his name. But, you know, just getting the material and building the house, I was literally doing the work. Now, they did the foundation and the excavation, and then I had ordered all of the wood windows and framework and stuff for that.
Were they prefabricated windows?
And I had set those out alongside of the fire plug, and I was staining them at night and getting ready. And then they came in and they started the courses of brick. And I called this friend of mine who had volunteered to work for me when he had spare time as a carpenter at a fixed rate. And he agreed that he would take time off and be there to set the windows as they called for him.
Mm-hmm.
And when the bricklayers saw what I was doing, they said, "You don't have to have anybody set the windows, we'll
We'll
set
do
them
it."
for you."
Uh-huh.
They just put things in, laid the bricks. But this woodworker taught me how to build a house. I started out by placing all the joists. He showed me how to do it, and I worked until I had them all finished. And then I would call him up, and he'd come and show me something else, and I'd work until it was finished. He helped me build a house, but he never worked for me full time. He worked one day at a time.
Were there other young couples doing the same thing?
I have no idea.
Hmm.
Well, this buddy of mine told me that he had done it,
Right.
and so I did it, but I
Right.
didn't know if anybody else was.
But it wasn't like a common thing.
Oh, I don't think so.
Okay. So you were recalled for Korea, which resulted in Albuquerque,
Yes.
and you had to leave that house.
Yes, we decided that when they called me up and said they were called up our whole reserve outfit. We talked to our dentist, and he was thinking about building a house, but he was renting someplace, and we said, "Well, you want to rent the house for a year?" He says, "Yeah." So they moved into the house.
And did you end up selling it to them?
No. Well, that was a couple years later, but when I was in the reserve, I was busy training pilots, as I said, to be flying instruments.
IFR.
And so then I got shipped out to Kwajalein, and
But were you in Albuquerque first before you went to Kwajalein?
yeah. Kwajalein was a part of
Kirtland?
Kirtland's operation.
Were you there when I know that Mom was extremely pregnant when you moved there with me.
Yes.
So were you there when I was born?
Oh, yes.
And then how soon after that did you leave? I was born in June of '51.
I would have to look the dates up, but it was... What I was doing in Kwajalein is I was sent there for a nuclear bomb tests in the Marshall Islands. And actually the tests that we were doing were the first two thermonuclear bombs. The atom bomb had been dropped before.
So is this
but
hydrogen?
These were the hydrogen bombs.
Beyond atomic, yeah.
And so we were out there for the test of those two weapons, and that's
And you saw
my
those.
year.
You saw those explosions.
Oh, they were many miles away. We did hear one,
Okay.
and it was 400 and some miles away.
Oh,
Shoot.
wow, wow.
Damn, you heard it.
Okay.
Shoot.
I'm gonna well, tell me what things that stand out for you as you think about being a dad in the 1950s.
Well, probably the biggest thing is we bought a new car.
Is that the Nash or the Plymouth?
That was a Plymouth. To bounce back a little bit, when I
Okay.
came back from Italy, we had never owned an automobile. And so we went out and bought a used Ford. And that's what we did through those years when I was building the house. I had driving this Ford. And then when Carol came along, we needed a little more dependable vehicle, so we bought the Belvedere, Plymouth Belvedere. And it was a very nice automobile. Okay, now,
And did that go to Albuquerque with you, or did you sell it before you left Chicago?
oh boy,
Because Mom said she took the train with Carol.
yes. No, I think I still had the Ford then, and I had driven it down, and she came down to join us, and I met her at the train station.
She said that was
I
a bad,
had-
that was a bad day. There had been a plane crash that day.
Yeah, there was a plane crash on our base, and
What kind of plane crashed?
it was a B-36, which was the biggest airplane you ever saw. It wasn't really a crash, it was an accident where the airplane had touched down and it ran off the runway and ripped off two landing gears and tied up the whole airfield because
Oh,
of it.
yeah.
But were there people survived though?
Oh yeah, there were.
Okay.
My recollection is that there were nobody lost on that. But anyway,
So you were a dad in the 1950s
yeah,
in Albuquerque.
48.
Well, what do you remember about the 50s and raising kids and that whole era?
Well, I thought we did a pretty good job. We managed to put a house together, and I kept, building things. For example, when we first got there, we got a duplex house
At
that we
Thaxton?
rented an apartment in, and that was a little tight, and so we started thinking about bigger house. I was making money now. We'd saved money here and there. We were making our house payments,
So you moved to Truman Street.
and then we went to Truman Street.
Now, did you do a lot of flying when you were in Albuquerque?
I flew all the time, whenever I had the opportunity, and I was the head of flying training at Kirtland Air Force Base. Now, there were organizations on the base that were fully manned, like the National Guard Fighter Squadron was, complete, and we had nothing to do with that. But then the 4925th was an experimental nuclear aircraft operation, and that we didn't have anything to do with. But in base operations, our responsibility was to provide continued training for all pilots who were rated and needed to fly their 4 hours a month and upgrade and so forth. So in base operations, I started out first, I was the head of the flying equipment office, and I was the head of the flight records section, which had 4 women in it. And then I was the head of the transient alert function, and that was every time an airplane landed, we sent a truck out to park it and so forth, take care of it. So I had those 3 functions, and then I went into flight training, and that was what I did the rest of the time that I was there before I got my degree.
What were you flying then?
I flew C-47s, C-45s, B-25s, L-20s,
A lot of big things.
everything we had, you know.
Did you like the P-40?
Well, P-40 was not at that time.
Yeah,
That
it was long before.
I love the P-40. Yeah, it was going to be what the 51 was supposed to be like, except 51 was safer and bigger and faster. But yes, I love fighters.
Tell the story about John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson visiting Kirtland Air Force Base.
All right, I'll be glad to tell you that story because I thought it was very important.
One second.
Okay,
Just gonna start this over.
all right.
Alright, go for it.
I can't remember the year now, but it was at that time.
62, I would guess.
And it was in December, and most of the people in operations had gone on leave or were gone, and so I was called in to be a representative of our division at a staff meeting of the Weapons Center. And in the staff meeting, they said, President
Kennedy?
has agreed to give the Air Force 2 days for education, and the air staff wants to know what we should show him. And this is brought up all over the country in all of these staff meetings and said, what do we want to show the president? And I was there representing my division, and I said, well, I'm quite sure that President Kennedy has not ever seen a nuclear weapon. And I have a collection of all of the nuclear weapons that we have. It's the only place in the world that they're all in one place. These are not real weapons, but they look like it. They are training weapons that we made so that they could be used to handle these things. And then other people could talk about other aspects of this that the president should know, but to get the feel for what nuclear weapons look like, we don't want to take a real one out there because that would be a violation of everything. You only do move those if you have to. And it went up the air staff and back down again, and they approved it. So I was appointed the person in charge of our presentation for President Kennedy.
How old were you then?
No, I
Early
don't-
60s, so 30.
You get the year and you can figure out from how old I am, but anyway. So I arranged to get all of these training weapons moved from Albuquerque to Eglin Air Force Base. We were told that the final decision on what the president to see would be shown at Eglin Air Force Base, and all of the commands who have things to present to them will be there. So, we had the climatic hangar, which is one of the largest buildings in the world, and that was going to be divided up with walls that existed there. They have movable walls and doors and stuff. The nuclear weapon program would have half of the hangar, and the other half was as it turned out, would be a U-2 airplane and a B-57 that had the largest camera lens I have ever seen in my life. It was the full width of the air. And then, in addition to that, the other commands, like SAC would give him a what they call a METO takeoff, which means minimum interval takeoff, a full wing of B-52s, one right after another, to show how fast they could get airplanes in the air. But that was all by SAC, and they brought the airplanes in, but they brought them to the same place. And now, I had all of this half a building, and I had all of this equipment, and I had a staff of about 5 people who came from Kirtland with me. They were people that I needed to repaint these things and take scratches out of things and polish trucks and loading devices and all that stuff. And so we were down there, and then my boss, who was a lieutenant colonel at the time, and I was only a major, he decided he was going to give the briefing to the president, and that was all right with me because he knew a lot more about all of these weapons, and I didn't want to study them all because I knew what my job was, and I did not have time to do that. So that was fine. And all of these people started coming down for a briefing on what the president was going to be seeing, but my boss was busy doing others, so I briefed most of the people in the preliminary briefings, telling them what we were going to tell the president. I had the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and I had the Air Force Chief of Staff, and I don't know who all. They all came in groups, and we gave them a briefing of what we're going to tell them. Mm-hmm. And that was fine. And it came off pretty well. Not only that, at this briefing, the car, the president's car, was the only one that was going to be allowed into the hangar. And this was going to be the president sitting in the rear right seat. And next to him was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then there was two president security people in the
Secret Service.
2 seats driving, and then there, and in the center was his Air Force aide. And walking alongside and leaning over so he could hear the sound of what our microphones were telling the president was Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, so he could hear what's going on.
But he had to run?
He had to walk along the track. And in addition to that, there were about 6 or 7 Congress people, and I don't really know who they were, but they were the only ones allowed to see this briefing because it was top secret, and top secret.
So were you in the car, or were you also?
I was walking alongside. I was told to go along with the people who couldn't get up close to it, and they could ask me questions. And I only had one question to ask. Is there a men's room here?
So that was a big day in your life?
That was a big day, yes.
To report to the Commander-in-Chief?
Yeah, and had the Commander-in-Chief and the Vice Commander at the same time.
Vice President.
Plus all of the head of the Air Force.
Now, I have the impression, and maybe I'm wrong, that you felt that it was kind of insulting to Lyndon Johnson to have to...
Well, no, I don't think it was insulting. It was the only thing they really could do, but he's the Vice President, and
Yes,
there wasn't room for him in the car if he had his staff there.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to jump to when you got your orders for the Philippines. How did you feel about that? You had finished at USC, gotten your master's.
Okay, all right. Let's see. Well, we finished up at USC, and they contacted me and said I was due for an assignment overseas, and they asked if that assignment to the Philippines would be all right with me. And I said, certainly. I had finished at school and had nothing firm. Oh, they started out, they said, where would I like to go? And I said, well,
Did you say Albuquerque?
yeah, I did say, well, no, I'm getting a little tangled up. No, it was an assignment that they had identified me to go to, and so that was fine with me. There were some other transfers around a little bit later that I can think of now, but and it was a fine assignment. I was sent over there to 13th Air Force, which was the principal Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, except for the 7th Air Force, which was actually in Vietnam. So the 13th Air Force had all of the rest of the organizations, and the commander was Benjamin O. Davis. Well, he wasn't there then. The commander that I was there when I got there was James E. Wilson, beyond a doubt the most horrible officer I had ever worked for.
What made him awful?
He was a SAC general, and he had no logical way to present things to people. He aggravated everybody that worked for him, but he was a 3-star general, so he was the commander.
So how was Davis different?
Davis was a perfect gentleman, and when he asked a question, he made the question right on the point. Everybody,
Precise.
no question about what he was asking and stuff, and he got everything done a lot faster.
He was a Tuskegee Airman.
Yes, he was the start of Tuskegee Airmen.
Do you remember, because would you have still been in 48 when Truman desegregated the armed forces? Were you
48, I was in the reserve.
Okay. So do you remember parts of that process of desegregating?
We didn't see any of it. I
just
was
was
in a
done.
reserve outfit in Chicago, and we had some blacks in our organization already, but they didn't expand it like they did later.
So when did you first notice that really happening? Was it in Albuquerque or?
As far as I was concerned, there were always blacks there, and we had no difference. I had black friends and
Yeah.
flew with blacks and so forth.
I know that you were particularly impressed with General Davis.
Well, General Davis was the greatest gentleman I have ever met, literally. He showed respect to everybody, and yet he had the rank, but he didn't order people around. He talked to them, discussed, what do you think of this, He was the top of the line.
So talk about what you did in the Philippines, and then you were, I know for part of that you were doing some flying back and forth from Vietnam, and there was one dramatic night for you.
Well, yeah. My job when I got to the Philippines was in operations. As you perhaps know, the base was very large, and it had a lot of different organizations all packed onto this one base. And there were an awful lot of airplanes because they were coming through, going to and from Vietnam, and airlift and all that stuff. When I got there, I was assigned to operations, and they said, what do you want to do? And I said, whatever you got for me. And I had the clearances required to do all the communications things, like running the cryptography department and so forth. And so I was made an assistant operations officer, and the first thing they, after I got rid of General James E. Wilson, I had other interesting people there, like all kinds of people that are important in the Air Force were coming in through and so forth. And I was enjoying being there, and my job was to brief them on what was going on in 13th Air Force. And also, no, that was a job that the general gave me. My job was to brief him on the current situation in our various organizations. They all reported them into my office, and we put it together into a briefing for them. But then General Davis asked me to be prepared to brief all of his guests. So every time an ambassador or a visiting general something
Senator
or other
or
came in, I gave them a briefing, and that was a job of considerable responsibility.
Did you ever brief anyone really interesting or someone that came over
Oh, I
that
was,
stands out in your mind?
a lot of these were ambassadors, and a lot of them were commanders of foreign governments and things like that, that were there to find out what 13th Air Force was doing. And my job was to tell them where and what we were doing.
was 13th Air Force also in Vietnam?
13th Air Force was supporting Vietnam, but we also had all of the bases in Thailand, and we had a base or two in Laos, but the 7th Air Force ran Vietnam.
Vietnam itself.
And that was in country.
Okay.
We had all of the dependents of 7th Air Force living at Clark.
At Clark.
Yeah.
Up on the hill mostly.
Up with us, yeah.
In the last house we were in. Were you yes. Were you happy to get the assignment when we left the Philippines? Were you happy to be going to Maryland or?
Well, of course, I didn't know what I was getting into. That was, when I left the Philippines, as you know, I was assigned to the F-4 SPO, and I had orders to eventually be in the Naval Air Systems Command, F-4 SPO, which was joint service, both services. And the Air Force's counterpart was out in Hill Field, and so that's where I reported, but I was in a detachment in the Pentagon, not in the Pentagon, in the Navy, Naval Headquarters in Washington.
Okay. I want to get you to talk more about being a dad and what it was like to have us 3 kids. And
Well, there's 3 kids, and all of them are smart and a challenge, but I think they all came out pretty behaved. They didn't get away with a lot of crap.
did you have a philosophy of child rearing?
Yes, teach them. Give them the opportunity, but make sure they learn what they're supposed to learn.
Can you elaborate any further on that?
Well, you were exposed to it. You were told what you could and couldn't do. You were pretty well laid out what could be and what the opportunities were that I could give you, and that was true of all of you. So that was my, treat them like I would treat a bunch of Boy Scouts. They're fine people and they got things to learn.
Anything more than that?
Well, I loved them all, but
That's about it.
what else should I have done?
I don't know. I just
I didn't feed you, I don't think. I
You-
provided the food and stuff at the time, but your mother was capable of keeping you busy and doing your things that had to do. And I supported you when you had special operation requirements. I gave Carol some advice, for example, on whether she should go to college instead of computers, and she took my advice, and so.
Okay. Do you have advice for, I think about my kids may have kids eventually. Do you have advice for them about how they should raise their kids? Or not raise them?
Well, I would hope they would raise them something like they have been exposed to.
So let's take a break.
All right.
Bill, Ben, if you could